Most people believe funeral homes are places of quiet respect rooms, filled with flowers, hushed voices, and final goodbyes. They rarely think about what happens behind the closed doors, away from the mourner's eyes. There are details that never make it onto the paperwork, things the living are not meant to see. A mark in the wrong place. A body that arrives with questions no one wants answered. A tag that doesn't match the person it's tied to. What you're about to read isn't about spirits or the afterlife. It is about the living, those with reasons to kill and the means to make sure no one asks why. These halls hold more than grief. They hold secrets. I've learned that every wake has its own rhythm. Some move quickly, guests arrive, offer condolences, take a last glance at the deceased, and leave with polite handshakes. Others are slower, heavier, as if time itself thickens inside the walls of the funeral home. Those are the ones that linger, both in the schedule and in the memory. That night was one of them. It was late autumn, and rain had been falling since the afternoon. Not the sudden downpour that rattles against the roof, but a patient, steady drizzle that seemed determined to soak through the bones of the town. The family of the deceased, a well-known schoolteacher named Mrs. Lillian. Kane had asked if they could keep the wake open past the usual hour. They wanted to give friends from out of town more time to arrive. I agreed, though I knew it would push the cleanup well past midnight. I've been the director of Halle & Sons Memorial for 18 years. The & Sons part is more tradition than truth. I have no children, and the Hall family line ended with my predecessor. But the name stayed, etched in gold leaf above the front door. Some people in town have joked that I'm married to the dead, and in a way, they're right. My days and too many of my nights belong to the departed and those left behind. By 10:45 p.m., most of the guests had gone. The lingering smell of fresh lily and roses was beginning to fade, replaced by that faint chemical sweetness from the embalming room down the hall. Only Mrs. Kane's immediate family remained, gathered near the casket in the main viewing room, room 2. I hovered discreetly near the door, not to intrude, but to be available if they needed anything. My assistant, Marla, was in the kitchenette brewing another pot of coffee, her tired silhouette outlined by the soft yellow light. The other staff had already left. Keeping them past 10 felt unnecessary for a small group like this. The viewing room was a warm space by design mahogany panels, dim wall sconces casting amber halos, and thick carpet that muffled footsteps. A low hum from the heating vents filled the silence between whispered conversations. Mrs. Kane's daughter sat closest to the casket, head bowed, occasionally brushing her fingertips along the white satin lining as if memorizing its texture. Her brother stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder. Their father, the widower, sat apart, stiff-backed, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, the way people sometimes do when they're looking at something only they can see. At 11:15, they finally began to gather their coats. I stepped forward to murmur that they could take as much time as they wished, but they thanked me and said they'd return in the morning before the service. As they walked toward the exit, their footsteps softened into the wet shuffle of the rain-soaked entryway. I exhaled. The house was nearly mine again. Marla emerged from the kitchenette, holding a half-empty mug. "I'll start tidying up room 2, she said. "I'll finish locking up after that," I replied. She nodded and disappeared into the viewing room. I busied myself with the guest book, sliding it into its leather case, making mental notes about tomorrow's arrangements. 5 minutes later, I decided to check on her progress. I stepped into the viewing room, and at first I thought she was still in there, but Marla was gone. The chairs had been neatly pushed back into place, the casket closed, the flowers straightened. And then I saw him. In the far corner of the room, near the archway that led to the side corridor, stood a man. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and dressed in a long, dark overcoat that reached nearly to his shoes. A wide-brimmed hat cast a deep shadow over his face. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him, and his posture was perfectly still, like a statue set in the dimness. My first thought was that he was a late-arriving guest who had slipped in without me noticing. But something about his stillness made my throat tighten. In this line of work, you learn to read the difference between a mourner lost in thought and something else. "Sir?" I called quietly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't move. I took a few steps closer, the carpet swallowing the sound of my shoes. "Sir, I'm afraid visiting hours are over for tonight." Still nothing. The air in that corner felt colder, just enough for the hairs on my arms to lift beneath my suit jacket. I was close enough now to see that the brim of his hat was old-fashioned, something you'd see in photographs from the 1940s. The overcoat, too, had a cut you didn't see anymore, with high, stiff lapels. Then, without a word, he turned not toward me, but toward the side corridor and stepped out of sight. I followed immediately, my shoes whispering against the carpet, but when I rounded the corner was empty. The only door down that hallway was the service closet, locked from the outside. The other end of the corridor led directly back into the main lobby, where Marla was now stacking coffee cups, completely unaware of any visitor. "Did you see someone leave just now?" I asked. She looked up, puzzled. "No." "Why?" I hesitated. "Never mind." I went back to room 2. The air was warmer now, as if whatever chill had clung to that corner had dissolved. But something else caught my attention. On the polished wood near the guest-book table, there was a faint ring of water, as though someone had set down a dripping umbrella. No one had been in here since the Kanes left. At least, no one I could account for. That night, after Marla had gone home, I stayed behind longer than I needed to. The rain outside had deepened into a soft, unbroken hiss against the roof, and the building felt heavier in its silence. I sat at my desk, flipping open the old bound ledgers we keep not for official records, but for tradition. Every family served here has their names entered by hand. I've always liked the continuity of it. It's one of the few things the living and the dead share. I turned to the fresh page for the Kane family. I had already written their names in careful script, leaving space at the bottom for the signatures of close family members. And there, at the very bottom of the page, was a name I had not written. Victor High. The ink was darker than mine, almost black, with a faint smudge at the tail of the E. The handwriting was elegant but old-fashioned, with long, looping descenders you don't see anymore. No one by that name had attended tonight's wake, and I knew it well, because Holly was the name of my predecessor, the man whose portrait still hung in the upstairs office. He had no living relatives, and Victor was not among the handful of Hales buried in the town cemetery. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Rain drummed softly against the window, and somewhere in the building, a heating duct gave a long, low creak. It should have been impossible. But then again, impossibility is not a luxury you can cling to for long in this profession. There are nights when the building settles into itself, like an old animal tucking its limbs beneath its body. The roof sighs, the vents exhale, and the photographs on the stairwell sepia. Men and women who once ran this place seem to grow heavier in their frames. I've come to recognize that kind of night as the prelude to a discovery. Not a revelation, exactly. More like a thread catching on a nail. The thread, this time, was ink. I kept staring at the name in the ledger, Victor Hall. The loops in the V and H were too graceful to be modern, drawn by a hand that had learned penmanship when slanted letters were an emblem of good breeding. It was the kind of script older undertakers wrote on burial permits and invoices. The kind customers still bring in when they want us to match the font on a headstone. Only this wasn't a relic. The ink was darker than mine, fresher. It carried the faint, metallic sheen that fountain pens leave when the lights hit them at an angle. Marla had left 20 minutes earlier. The Kanes were long gone. The front door was latched and the alarm armed. At least, the panel by the office said so. No one else had been here to write this name. And yet there it was, a neat signature like a pressed flower. I tilted the ledger, letting the desk lamp glow across the paper. The tail of the E in Hall bled into the fiber ever so slightly, like it had been written by a nib that had just touched a wet inkwell. Impossible, my mind said. But impossibility has a way of standing in the doorway here, never fully entering, never fully leaving. I stood, carried the book to the small corridor outside room 2, and set it on the guest table where I'd found it earlier in the evening. A ring of water still glinted faintly on the polished wood. I pressed my finger into it. It was tacky, not wet. A memory of wetness. The room smelled like lily and rain-soaked wool. Okay, I whispered to the empty chairs. You made your introduction. I took the ledger back to my office, unlocked the bottom drawer, and retrieved a zip pouch where we keep spare cotton gloves and a small UV flashlight. It's not standard equipment for an undertaker, but habits from overlapping worlds tend to accumulate. Under the UV, ballpoint ink often shines with a bluish fluorescence. Fountain pen ink can dull into a brown-gray. The name Victor Hall absorbed the light like a dark well. The rest of the page, the entries I'd made earlier for the Kane family, glimmered faintly. Not ballpoint. Not the same pen as mine. I scanned the security feeds on my office monitor. One camera watched the lobby, another the corridor outside room 2. A third, tucked discreetly into the crossbeam of room 2's doorway, caught a slice of the guest table if the viewing door stood open. I rewound to the moment when the Kane family left. I saw Marla straighten the chairs, close the casket, align the spray of roses, and then, after a glance at the clock, turn off the chandelier and slip out. The camera caught only darkness for a few seconds, and then a smudge, as though the lens had been dragged through fog. The door to room 2 was still open an inch, a mouth held in an almost word. Through that inch, the guest table floated in a sickle of light from the corridor sconce. A shadow crossed the table. It didn't have shape the way a person has shape. It was denser darkness, a moving absence. It stopped at the table and lingered. The camera stuttered one frame, 2, and then the shadow slid backward, and the door eased shut as if grasped by wind. But there was no wind here. The HVAC had cut off at 11. I leaned closer and froze the frame. On the table, the ledger sat where I'd left it. The bottom of the page was a pale blur. When I advanced to the present, the blur had become lines, strokes, a signature. I saved the clip to an external drive, without quite knowing why reflex. Perhaps, or the superstition, that if you anchor a thing to a second medium, it becomes less likely to unmake itself. The name Hawaii floated in my head like a buoy in dark water. There is a portrait upstairs, a man in his 30s with a severe part and a vest buttoned to strangulation. The brass plate beneath it reads Edmund R. Hawley, director, 1919 to 1958. The Hawley and Sons came later, when Edmund partnered with a cousin to expand the business to neighboring counties. None of the old histories mentioned a Victor, but I'd never checked the really old ledgers. I brought my keyring and crossed the lobby. The stairwell to the archive room creaked on the 4th step, as it always does. A hand pressed to a bruised rib. The archive door's lock has always been temperamental. It likes to accept the key slowly, as if it needs to recognize your scent. The room beyond is narrow, lined with metal shelving, and always 5 degrees cooler than anywhere else in the building. Old paper hoards cold like a pit does damp. We keep ledgers arranged by decade, spine-labeled in gold leaf by a sign-maker who retired before I was born. I found the 1950s volume, slid it free. and carried it to the small reading desk where a single green-shaded lamp throws light like a circle of testimony. The earliest years in each ledger read like a town's family album. Birth names, maiden names, the single word minor or teacher or widow. Pages breathed out the perfume of mildew and ink. I flipped slowly, letting the dead rise in their orderly procession. And then, on a page marked with a brittle ribbon, I saw it, July 17th, 1953. Memorial Service, Victor L. Hall, 1918 to 1953. Notes, cenotaph only. Remains not recovered. Cause, residential fire presumed. Widow, Evelyn Holly, née Whitaker. Daughter, Margaret, 8. The words hit the back of my throat the way smoke does. A service without a body. A name without a grave. I traced the thin black lines of the entry. Edmund Hale's name appeared at the bottom in the same precise hand that hung in his portrait upstairs. The service was held in the main chapel, what we now call Room 3. The officiant was Reverend Somerton. A community choir sang, "Abide with me." That was all. There were no invoices attached to the entry. No burial permit. Just a memorial card glued to the margin, its cardstock gone fox-brown with age. I turned the page, and a brittle clipping slid out and landed against my wrist. It was from the Elk Haven Courier, our local paper, July 16th, 1953. Blaze takes Holly home. One presumed lost. Subheading, Evelyn Holly and daughter escape night fire. Victor Holly unaccounted for. Paragraph. Flames engulfed the Holly residence on Sycamore and 4th, shortly after midnight Tuesday. Witnesses report Mr. Hall re-entered the building to retrieve a trunk of family papers. He did not emerge. Fire crews battled the blaze for 2 hours. Due to heat and structural collapse, search was postponed until daylight. By evening, no remains had been discovered. I read it twice, then held the clipping up to the lamp so that the threads of its paper glowed. That was 72 years ago. The ledger didn't mention what happened to Evelyn and the daughter. No follow-up entry, no second service. Just a note. Widow moved to sisters in Montclair. Back downstairs, the rain softened to a whispering mist. The red needle on the front panel flicked from armed to ready as the Hevic cycled back on. I set the 1950s ledger next to the present one. I had the sensation of pressing 2 mirrors together and watching the corridor of reflections multiply into a tunnel. Victor, I said aloud, unfamiliar with the sound of the name in my mouth. The desk clock clicked to midnight. The building became that other kind of quiet the quiet that listens back. The phone in my office has a coil cord because I refuse to surrender every ritual. I dialed the number of the library's local history desk. It went straight to the after-hours message, the recorded voice of Miss Anders, who has been there long enough to develop a priestly authority about the town. I left a message, then penned a note for the morning. Ask for property records Sycamore and 4th, summer 1953. Fire department logs. Obit compilations. And because the night had already shown me its teeth, I called one more number 1 I rarely use. The cell of Arthur Bly, the last living apprentice of Edmund Howell. He's 90 if he's a day, long retired, but he likes to answer these calls. He says the dead get restless in the rain. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Bly. "It's me, Arthur," I said. "From Holly and Sons." You sound like you found something in the paper room." His voice was tea and gravel. "A name," I said. "Victor Hawley." Silence, then a soft intake of breath, like he'd slid a blade from its sheath. "Ah," he said. "You know it," I said. "I know of it," he corrected. "I was a boy then." Sorriest business I ever saw Edmund draw breath through. He never did say what he saw at that house after the fire. "What do you mean, what he saw?" "You want stories at midnight," Arthur said. "Or you want sleep?" "I want the thing that will let me sleep," I said. He chuckled once, a small, precise sound. There's no such thing, but I'll give you the abbreviated gospel. There was a memorial for Victor. No body. Folks in town said he went back into the fire for something that wasn't worth burning up 4 papers, like the article said. Men do foolish sums when smoke gets between them and their people. Evelyn left afterward. Can't blame her. The house sat black-boned for a year. Here's what you want, though. Every few years, someone would say they saw a man in a long coat outside the chapel, hat pulled low. Never came in. Not when folks watched him, but he'd be there at the edges. The ones who claimed to see him used the same words. Tall, quiet, old-fashioned. Old-fashioned, I repeated, looking at the ledger with its looping letters. You've seen him, then? I've seen the corner of him, I said. And he signed our book. Arthur whistled, not unkindly. Ink is an expensive way to haunt. Do you remember if Victor had family here besides Evelyn? I asked. Cousins, maybe. Edmund once said, what was it? That Victor was good with old paper. He helped Edmund with records. He liked ledgers. Said they soothed him. The image hit me with the inevitability of rain sliding down a window. A man who loved ledgers, who vanished with a trunk of family papers, returning not as a moan or a knock, but as a line on a page. Arthur, I said softly, what did Edmund see at the house? I asked him that once, he said. What did you see? He told me he saw smoke come out of the ground like breath after the fire was out. Maybe it was just steam. But he said, there are people who don't know they've left the room yet, Arthur. They keep standing up to check the door. The line went quiet. We both listened to our separate houses breathe. Why the hat? I asked finally. Men wore hats then, he said. And a man who lost his face to fire might prefer a brim. Listen. His voice softened to a cottony whisper. Don't invite it. Don't bait it with questions it can't answer. If it knows how to write, it knows you can read. We said good night. I sat for a long minute, watching the external drive's small blue eye wink like something trying to stay awake. I should have gone home. Instead, I carried both ledgers back to room 2, set them on the guest table, and stood there with my hands on the polished edge, looking at the empty chairs. The rain eased. The building shifted somewhere in its ribs. What are you looking for? I asked the room, the way you ask a dog what it sees when it freezes and stares at a corner. What did you come back to sign? No answer, but the air in that far corner, the place where I had first seen the man in the hat, felt colder again. Cold enough to move as a sheet, to brush the hairs on my wrist. Cold enough to be deliberate. I stepped into it as if stepping into a river. It felt like leaning against a window pane in winter. A memory of cold, not the thing itself. Victor, I said. The name sounded more certain now, as if it were my turn in a conversation. If you're looking for someone, I don't have them. If you're looking for something, tell me what it is. A soft vibration, like a voice caught in the walls, hummed in the room's woodwork. Then it stopped. I stood there with my hands lightly touching the back of a chair, feeling ridiculous and solemn in equal measure. I slept in the cot in my office for a few hours. In the dream I had just before waking, the ledger pages turned by themselves, and the lines of names realigned to make different words. Halle, heel, hail. When the phone trilled at 7:03 a.m., I woke with the impression of snow and ash. It was Miss Enders from the library. I listened to your message, she said crisply. Property records show the Halle residence at Sycamore and 4th burned in July 1953, as you said. There's a note here, condemned, rebuilt 1955, by Whitaker family. Evelyn's maiden name was Whitaker, if I recall the obituary. Interesting. Obituary? I said, yes, Evelyn Whitaker Heil. Died in Montclair, 1972. It says she never remarried. Daughter Margaret is mentioned as surviving. No married name given for Margaret. Could you email me the scans? I asked. I can do better, she said. Stop by. We still have the microfiche of the courier for those years. Sometimes the margins tell a story the clipping books don't. I thanked her, hung up, and texted Mara that I'd be out for an hour. She replied with a thumbs up and a picture of the morning's flowers waiting in buckets, their stems trembling like newly arrived witnesses. I smiled despite myself and carried my coffee through the lobby. As I passed room 2, the door stood half open again, though I was sure I'd latched it. The guest table gleamed. The ledger lay where I'd left it. The headline name at the bottom, bright and dark, Victor Hawley. I ran my finger above the signature without touching it. The air felt warmer now. The room smelled faintly not of lily, but of something older. Singed cloth, a match blown out. On impulse, I opened the ledger to a blank page near the back and wrote in small, steady letters, "What are you looking for?" Then I closed the book, replaced it on the table, and left for the library. You learn to ask without expecting an answer, but you ask anyway. The local history room sits in the library's basement, where the light has the color of old soup and everything whispers because the ceiling is low. Miss Anders wore her gray cardigan like chainmail and set the microfiche reader for me with the competence of a surgeon. We pulled the reels for July 1953 and fed the machine with gentle clicks. The black and white frames flitted past like a procession of moths until we found the week of the fire. The front page photo showed a house beheaded by flame. In another, a woman with a scarf around her hair stood on the curb while 2 men in hats spoke to her with grim mouths. The caption read, "Mrs. Evelyn Hawley speaks with Fire Captain W.J. Dorner." No picture of Victor, of course. No body. But in a follow-up story, 3 days later, there was a sentence I might have missed if Miss Anders hadn't reached across the machine to tap the glass. "There," she said. "Read that." I leaned closer. Neighbors report Mr. Hawley was seen earlier that day, transporting a steamer trunk to his basement, believed to contain family documents and photographs. The trunk has not been recovered. Mrs. Hawley confirms Mr. Hawley had been sorting old business papers prior to the fire. Steamer trunk, I repeated, feeling the weight of the words. Old iron-bound, made to travel across oceans, not across years. Miss Anders squinted at me. "You look like a man who just found proof of something he already believed." "I found an echo," I said, which is sometimes the same thing. She pursed her lips. "One more for you." She flipped to a brief in the personals column. "Thanks to neighbors and to Mr. Edmund Hawley of Hawley. Funeral for his kindness to our family during our time of need. E.H." "That confirms that Edmund handled the memorial," I said. "The thanks is the kind of detail you don't get in ledgers." "Ledgers tell you what happened," she said. "Personals tell you how it felt." I left with photocopies folded into my jacket pocket. On the way back, I detoured down Sycamore Street. The house at 4th and Sycamore was no longer a black-boned ruin. It was a neat 2-story with white siding and a red door. No one was home. A wooden swing hung from the porch. It was hard to imagine flame taking a mouthful of that corner, biting the place where the porch now smiled. Back at the funeral home, the building met me with the chemical sweetness of fresh arrangements and the wakening bustle of a service day. Room 2 glowed with morning. The Canes had arrived early, their faces arranged into the new solemnity familiar to people who have learned their way around grief in a single punishing night. I offered the daughter my arm, and we walked to the casket together, the surface shining like a still pond. When the family settled, I returned to the guest table to put out fresh pens. The ledger lay where I'd left it, closed. There is a silence that belongs to paper. It's a holding breath silence, the kind that makes your fingertips feel too loud. I opened to the page where I had written, "What are you looking for?" Beneath my neat, small question, In that same old-fashioned hand, a reply waited. She's not here. The words were straighter than mine, as if laid with a ruler. They pressed into the paper enough to leave a ghost on the next page. A mote of ash impossible, but they rested on the flourish of the last E. I closed the book slowly. My heart did its clumsy two-step against my ribs. Not, I am not here. Not, I am Victor. A simple, flat declaration that did not bother to explain itself. She's not here. We held the Cain service without incident. The hymn hummed, the eulogy wove its careful path, and the murmuring of condolences braided strangers into a temporary family. I moved among them as directors do, present but not obtrusive, a conductor with a baton made of timing and tact. Yet the sentence pulsed at the edge of my vision like a warning light on a dashboard. She's not here. The man in the hat had stood at the corner of room 2 last night, not at room 3, where we sometimes hold larger services. He had written in our book, In My House, and he had taken the time to answer a question I hadn't been sure I was truly asking. Who was she? I retreated to the office when the last car pulled away. The portrait of Edmund Halley stared at me with the mild severity of men who did their grief in private. What would you do? I asked his varnished face. What did you do? The external drive sat in the desk drawer, humming its tiny electric hymns. I replayed the previous night's clip, then scanned forward to this morning's hours. Nothing. No smudges. No stutters. The camera is a coward. It only admits what it can explain. By habit, I reached for the file folder labeled Special Incidents, a private log I keep. Directors are archivists of the nearly impossible. We don't advertise it, and we don't make claims. We just write down what happens in case it happens again. I added a dated note. Signature Victor Halley appears in ledger. Message, she's not here, in response to question. Cold spot in room 2 persists in far corner. Odor of smoke intermittent. Then I turned to a fresh sheet and wrote a name I hadn't said aloud in years. Mrs. Heloise Whitcomb. She had been a receptionist here in the late 60s, when the building still smelled of coal dust in winter. She retired before I arrived, but when we ran a handful of obituaries through the paper one summer tributes to staff who had shaped the home she sent a card in an old-world hand, thanking us for remembering her. Something about the way she looped her capital H had lodged in my mind, the way certain seasons have a specific light. I dialed the number from the card, unsure whether it's still connected to anything but static. It rang 3 times. "Heloise," a woman said in a voice like a well-polished bell. "Mrs. Whitcomb," I said, grateful and surprised. "This is the director at Halley & Sons. We've never met, but the one with the tidy writing," she said. I laughed despite myself. "I had to know the writing of every director," she added. "What can I do for you, dear?" I explained in careful language. She made small, thoughtful sounds, like a seamstress testing a stitch. "Victor," she said at last. I remember hearing that name, only in whispers. Edmund didn't favor gossip. He was a fair man, but closed as a book left on a high shelf. A pause. He kept a drawer in his desk for things that didn't fit in the regular files. I only saw inside once, when he asked me to put a clipping there, not for the family, just for me, he said. It was from a New York paper, something about an old ship's trunk found in a flea market with letters inside. I thought it odd at the time. Did the clipping say whose letters? I asked. It didn't. It had a photograph. You could see the brass corners of the trunk. I remember because they were shaped like little shields. "Thank you," I said, my heartbeat picking up. "That helps me more than you know." "You'll find you already know more than you think," she said gently. "Be kind to the part of you that does. Midnight in a funeral home is not the same as midnight anywhere else. I've worked late in offices, locked up empty schools, even done an overnight shift at a hospital when my cousin was too sick to be alone. Each has its own kind of quiet, some brittle and watchful, others heavy and tired. But the quiet here, after the lights go down and the last lock clicks, has weight. It doesn't sit on your shoulders. It presses from the walls, from the floors, from the space between your ribs. It is the hush of people who have all said their last word and are now listening for yours. That night, I arrived back from an early dinner with the kind of certainty you don't question. I would keep the door open after midnight, just as the ledger had instructed. Whether it was an instruction, an invitation, or a dare, I wasn't sure. But in this work, you learn that not answering is often worse than answering. The rain had stopped some time after sunset. The parking lot shone with the last traces of water, black mirrors stretching between the lamplight puddles. Inside, the building smelled faintly of carnations and furniture polish. Marla had gone home at 6, the last staff member gone by 7. I spent the evening upstairs in the archive room, pretending to reorganize the 1970s ledgers while the minutes crawled toward 12. Every so often, I glanced at my watch, then at the stairwell door, as if something might be waiting just beyond it. At 11:57, I descended to the lobby. The lights were low, only the sconces by the front doors and the dim bulbs in the corridor leading to room 2. I stopped outside the viewing room, rested my hand on the doorframe, and took a slow breath. The hinges gave a soft sigh as I opened the door wide. Room 2 looked exactly as it had during the cane service. Polished casket on its stand, rows of chairs facing forward, guest table near the entrance. The far corner, the cold corner, was as empty as any other. For now, I sat in the second row, the one Mrs. Kane's daughter had used. The chair creaked faintly beneath my weight. In my hands, I turned a small audio recorder over and over. It was nothing fancy digital, with a single red light that would blink if it caught sound. I wasn't convinced it would capture anything. But sometimes an object gives you permission to notice things you'd otherwise overlook. The seconds felt louder than the room. Each tick from my watch seemed to travel farther, like sound in a church. The air was perfectly still. At 12:13, the temperature in the corner dropped. Not dramatically, not like stepping into a freezer, but enough for the skin on my forearms to tighten. I glanced at the recorder. Its red light blinked once. Then came the sound, the faintest shuffle, like cloth brushing against wood. It came from the far corner, just outside my peripheral vision. I turned slowly. He was there. The man in the long coat and wide-brimmed hat. The same stillness, the same posture, hands clasped in front, head bowed slightly so the brim hid most of his face. He stood at the edge of shadow, but I could see the line of his coat, the texture like worn wool, the glint of something at the collar that caught the dim light. "Victor?" I said, the name barely above a whisper. He did not move. The air between us had a density to it, as if sound would travel slower there. "You left me a message," I said. "She's not here. Who is she?" The man raised his head slightly. The shadow of the brim shifted, and for the first time, I saw more than darkness beneath it. Half his face was intact pale skin, sharp cheekbone, an eye that reflected the room's light like water. The other half was raw. Not melted in the way fire destroys, but fractured, as though the features had been smeared and blurred, the lines never quite redrawn. He spoke in a voice so low, I almost doubted it came from him. "She's not here." The same words. But now, each one carried a weight that made the air feel colder. "Your wife?" I asked. "Evelyn?" The name seemed to strike something. His head tilted, a movement both delicate and deliberate, and the good side of his mouth tightened in what might have been the beginning of a frown. "She left," he said, "before I could find her." The chair beside me creaked. I turned sharply empty. When I looked back, he was closer, still standing, but perhaps 2 paces nearer than before. I had not seen him move. "You've been coming here for years," I said, "looking for her in the services, in the rooms. Why here?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand and pointed toward the casket at the front of the room. "Because she'll come," he said. "Everyone comes here, in the end." The words made the small hairs at the base of my neck lift. I wanted to ask more, but the temperature in the room shifted again, this time warmer, as if whatever door had been open between us was starting to close. "Victor," I said quickly, "the trunk, the papers you went back for, do they matter?" His hand lowered. The brim of his hat tipped forward again, hiding his face. "Only if she reads them," he murmured. And then he stepped backward 1-2 paces into the farthest corner. The shadows seemed to accept him, thickening around his outline until there was nothing but the bare shape of a coat, and nothing at all. I sat there for several minutes, the recorder silent in my lap. The red light had stopped blinking. My own breathing sounded too loud. When I finally stood, the corner was just a corner again. The chill had gone. On the guest table, the ledger lay closed. I opened it. On the page where I had asked my question and received his answer, there was now a third line in the same measured hand. "She won't know the door. Keep it open." It was nearly 1 a.m. when I locked up and went home, the words following me into the dark. "She won't know the door." It sounded less like a clue and more like a warning. That night, my dreams were filled with corridors, narrow, dark, and endless, lined with doors that opened onto empty rooms. In every one, a trunk sat in the center, brass corners catching the light. And in every one, I opened the trunk and found only smoke. Some hauntings feel like closed loops, a single night, a single gesture, replaying until someone notices. But what I had stumbled into with Victor was not a loop. It was a trail. And trails, if you follow them far enough, lead you somewhere you may not want to go. The phrase he left, "She won to know the door," had lodged itself in my mind like a shard of glass under the skin. I turned it over and over, looking for its edges. Did he mean a literal door? A room in the funeral home? Or something else entirely, a door between here and wherever he believed his wife had gone? Digging in the past, the next morning, I returned to the library's history room, the scent of old paper greeting me like a familiar, but not entirely welcome perfume. Miss Anders raised an eyebrow when she saw me. "Back so soon?" she asked. "I need everything you can find on Evelyn Hawley after the fire," I said. "Montclair, 1953 to 1972, and her daughter Margaret." She disappeared into the stacks, leaving me with the quiet hum of the microfiche machines. 20 minutes later, she returned with a thin folder. Inside were photocopies of obituaries, a brief in a Montclair newspaper about a local woman volunteering at a church, and a school yearbook photo of a young girl with the caption "Margaret Hawley, grade 4. But it was the obituary that caught my attention. Evelyn Whitaker Haw, 52, died at home in Montclair after a long illness. Survived by her daughter, Margaret Haw. Preceded in death by her husband, Victor L. Haw. Services private. Private services. No public farewell. No reason for her to ever set foot back in this town or this funeral home. If Victor had been waiting here all these years, was he waiting in the wrong place? To Whitaker House by mid-afternoon, I was in my car, heading toward Montclair. It's a 2-hour drive, mostly through stretches of farmland that in winter look like open wounds under the snow. I found the address from the obituary. The house was modest, 2 stories, with faded blue shutters and a garden choked by winter weeds. The mailbox still read high. I knocked. No answer, but from the porch I could see into the front hall an old hall tree with 3 hooks, a small shelf, and a mirror framed in carved oak. On the shelf sat a black and white photograph in a silver frame, a young woman in a cloche hat, smiling just enough to be polite. Evelyn, I don't know what I expected. A chill, a whisper, a movement in the corner of my vision. But the house gave me nothing. Only the quiet of a place long emptied. The grave that wasn't. Montclair Cemetery held Evelyn's grave near the back, in a row where the stones leaned slightly from years of frost heave. Her marker was simple. Evelyn Whitaker Halley, 1920 to 1972, beloved mother. No mention of being a wife. No Victor. The grass around the stone was thin, as if no one had visited in years. I stood there for a long time, hands in my coat pockets, and realized I felt a strange kind of guilt. Victor had gone into the fire, maybe for something foolish, maybe for something important, and in the end, his wife had been buried without him, in a town 2 hours away. If this was the door, she'd already passed through it without looking back. The unfinished promise, back at the funeral home that evening. I sat in my office with the lights low, the ledgers open in front of me. I thought of the last time I'd seen Victor's figure, how he had pointed to the casket and said, "Everyone comes here, in the end." Was that his promise? That he'd be here when she arrived? But she never did. The room no one uses. There's a small preparation room in the east wing that we almost never use anymore. The lighting is harsh, the ventilation poor, and it smells faintly of old wood and iodine, no matter how often we clean it. But it has one unique feature, a door at the back that opens onto a narrow hallway leading nowhere. When I first took over the funeral home, I was told the hallway used to connect to the neighboring building long since demolished, but the door was kept for storage access. Now it opens to a blank wall of cinder block. That night, while the building settled into its midnight quiet, I walked to that room. I don't know why. Maybe it was because of the ledger's message. Maybe because I was looking for any door that might mean something. I stood in front of the cinder block wall. The air here was colder, though there was no vent nearby. I ran my hand over the rough surface. For a moment, I thought I heard something on the other side, a faint scrape, like paper being dragged across wood. The sound stopped. And then, from the far end of the hallway, where it met the prep room, came the soft rhythm of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, Victor emerged from the darkness, the brim of his hat low, his coat brushing the walls. He stopped a few feet away from me, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "She won't know the door," he said again, as if reminding me of something I'd already forgotten. "Then show her," I said. His head tilted. "Not my choice," he replied. "Doors open both ways, but not for the same hands." He reached into his coat and withdrew something, a small, scorched envelope, edges brittle, the paper warped by heat. He held it out. I took it carefully. The name on the front was written in the same looping script as his ledger signature, Evelyn. "What do you want me to do with this?" I asked. He stepped back toward the shadows. "Make sure she finds it," he said. "If she's not here, maybe she's somewhere else." And then he was gone, the air warming slightly in his absence. I stood there in the empty hallway, the envelope in my hands, and realized the farewell he'd been chasing wasn't his. It was hers. He hadn't stayed behind to be found. He'd stayed behind to deliver something she'd never received. Somehow, across the years and whatever lay beyond them, he still believed it was possible. Some things feel heavier than they are. The scorched envelope barely weighed an ounce, but in my palm it carried the weight of 72 years. The edges flaked if I touched them wrong. The faint smell of smoke clung to it, as though the fire had only gone out yesterday. I didn't open it. Not yet. Part of me feared that if I did, the message inside would vanish, disperse like ash in a gust. Another part feared that reading it would make me complicit in whatever unfinished business kept Victor tethered here. The next morning, I called Miss Anders again. "I need to find someone," I told her. "Margaret Halley, she'd be in her 80s now." Miss Anders whistled softly. "Not many of those left to track." Give me an hour. By the time she called back, my coffee was cold. There's a Margaret Hoy listed in a retirement home in Montclair, she said. No family noted. You want the address? The retirement home smelled of disinfectant and weak tea. A nurse led me to a sunlit lounge where an elderly woman sat near the window, watching sparrows peck at the frozen lawn. Margaret? I asked. She turned, her eyes cloudy but alert. Yes, I introduced myself, explaining carefully that I worked at the funeral home where her father's memorial had been held. I never knew much about that, she said, voice slow. Mother didn't like to talk about it. Said some things are better left behind. I held out the envelope. I think this was meant for your mother, from your father. It never reached her. Her hands trembled as she took it. The brittle paper crackled under her fingers. For a moment, she didn't move, just stared at the name written on the front. Would you like me to read it to you? I offered. She shook her head. No, I think I already know what it says. She opened it slowly, carefully, as though unsealing a vein. Inside was a single sheet of paper, browned and curled at the edges. The handwriting was unmistakable looping, deliberate. Evelyn, if you found this, I didn't make it out. I went back for the trunk, because it held our letters, your mother's photographs, the first drawing Margaret made at school. If I could not leave, I wanted them safe. I hope you're safe too. I will wait where we last said goodbye. Margaret read it twice, lips moving without sound. Then she folded it back into the envelope and pressed it to her chest. My mother was buried in Montclair, she said quietly. She never went back to that funeral home. She didn't know, I said. She wouldn't have believed it, even if she had. That night, I left room 2's door open again after midnight. The building was still, the air cool. The ledger lay on the guest table, its pages waiting. I placed the envelope beside it. She got it, Victor, I said aloud. She knows. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, from the far corner, the cold deepened. The man in the hat was there more solid than I'd ever seen him, as if the shadows themselves were holding him upright. He looked at the envelope, then at me. Slowly, he removed his hat. The ruined side of his face seemed softer now, less fractured. The good eye shone faintly, not with light, but with something like relief. She knew, I said again. He gave a single, deliberate nod. Then he turned not toward the side corridor, but toward the back wall of the room. The air shimmered faintly there, like heat above asphalt, though the cold was sharper than ever. And then he stepped through it. The shimmer faded. The room warmed. The corner was just a corner again. In the morning, I found the ledger open to a blank page. At the top, in the same precise hand, was a final line. Thank you. No signature. No flourish. Just the words. I closed the book, replaced it on the shelf, and let the silence of the room settle around me. Some hauntings end with a scream, others with a vanishing. This one ended with a note. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the building exhale a slow, deep release, like someone finally letting go of a held breath. But sometimes, when the rain is steady and the halls are empty, I find myself glancing toward that far corner of room 2, not expecting to see him, exactly, just checking the door, because doors open both ways. And some promises keep walking long after the people who made them are gone. People assume the worst part of my work is the cold. They're half right. The cold room is a bitey, industrial kind of chill stainless steel, humming compressors, a thermometer that creeps between 36 and 39 degrees. After a while, you learn to dress for it. Nitrile gloves under latex, a thermal layer beneath the black suit if you're going to be in and out all day. The cold you don't dress for is the one that gets into your head when in fact want to fit the shape it is supposed to. When a mark on the skin refuses to agree with the story on the paperwork. That started on a Tuesday. We took delivery at 2:40 p.m. I remember the time because the hospital transport was late, and I had a service at 4, the kind of squeeze that turns a quiet day into an obstacle course. The driver rolled the gurney over the threshold with the weary competence of a man who had done it 1,000 times. Black bag, standard zipper, tag hooked at the top with the patient label folded on itself from condensation. Single vehicle accident, he said, signing the chain of custody form on my clipboard. Hospital released. No ME jurisdiction. No ME? I glanced at the form. Our county coroner system is elected, which means in theory we get a medical professional. In practice, we get whoever can count votes. Some deaths that should go to the medical examiner don't, especially if the ER physician is comfortable signing a cause. It keeps caseloads down. It keeps budgets down. It also keeps questions down. Doctor signed, the driver said, tapping the line. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, motor vehicle collision. Family's already downstairs doing paperwork. We wheeled the gurney into the prep room because I needed to do a preliminary before refrigeration clothing inventory, personal effects, a quick external survey. I try to keep intake to a rhythm. Confirm bracelet, tag the ankle, note any identifying marks, log everything. The ritual keeps the human part of it anchored. I unzipped the bag. Male, mid-30s, short-cropped hair, faint 5 o'clock shadow. The EA'd done a pass. Washed blood away from the face, left the rest as found beneath the trauma shears. Clothing collected in a hospital evidence bag. Jeans, work boots, a high-waist jacket with reflective tape. Name? Marla asked from the doorway. My assistant was in her scrubs, a clipboard tucked against her side. Hair braided tight like she was going into a storm. Cole Benton, I said, reading from the bracelet. Dob 89. Pronounced 117, She jotted it down. Wife's in the arrangement room. Wants a next-day viewing if we can swing it. We'll see what we've got, I said, more to myself than to her. The face was swollen on the right side, a purplish bloom that would go slate in the cold. Nose impacted but not badly displaced. No road rash along the cheek or forehead. The seatbelt sign, the diagonal bruise you see across the chest in real crashes, wasn't obvious under the sternal edema. I pressed gently along the clavicle with gloved fingers. Movement, but no crepitus that screened a shattered rib cage. A notes say single car into a ditch, Marla said, scanning the copy in her hand. No other vehicles. Wrecker pulled it out around 2. He was alone. Airbags deploy? I asked. Doesn't say, she said. The A never says unless it's remarkable. They're busy trying to keep the breathing going, or when that fails, stop it gracefully. I started the external assessment the way I always do. Systematic, head to toe. Scalp had a small posterior laceration, approximated with Staples Classic for an interior strike. Ear canals clean. Eyes with petechia in the conjunctiva, not unusual with asphyxia or severe head trauma, but you catalog and move on. I noted everything on the embalming report. A neat grid of small boxes I've filled 1,000 times. The wrists stopped me. Under the soft, puffy swelling of a fresh death, there was a narrow band of discoloration around each wrist. Not the broad, soft mark you'd see from a jacket cuff pressed into the skin. This was precise. A ring, 1/2 an inch wide, pale in the center where pressure had been highest, flanked by faint abrasions. The pattern was too clean to be random. Marla, I said, keeping my voice even. Light. She angled the gooseneck lamp until the LED glare bit the welt. The skin had that waxy, new marble look, but the mark read like a story. Pressure applied, at least an hour, released before hospital intake. Seatbelt? She offered, doubt in the word. Seatbelts don't wrap wrists, I said. Ankles? We rolled the body using the three-handed dance we could do in our sleep, one stabilizing the head and shoulders, one at the hips, one at the legs. The back told a different story than the front. Lividity, the pooling of blood after death, had settled purplish along the lower back and upper thighs, which would make sense if he'd been supine for a while. But the ankles, there they were, the same narrow bands, right where a zip tie would sit, or a tape or a cord. Jesus, Marla whispered. There was more. On the lateral upper arm, a set of patterned contusions, a ladder of ovals, like someone's fingertips had dug in hard. On the inner thigh, a long, shallow abrasion at a diagonal, too straight to be a scrape in a ditch. The back of the shirt, when we unfolded it from the evidence bag, had gritty clay embedded in the fabric, not the sandy shoulder dust you get from skidding along a road. Where's the seatbelt sign? I said to no one. What if he wasn't wearing it? Marla said. Then I expect a different face. Benton's face was the face of someone who met a surface he knew was coming. What I didn't see was what the E-report told me to expect, the constellation of small glass nicks from a shattered windshield, the deep bruising over the hip from a lap belt, the paint transfer smears you sometimes find along the side of a head. I've seen accidents. I can tell their handwriting. I looked back at the chain of custody form. The coroner had declined. Signed off by an A. Dr. H. Indecipherable scribble with no suspicious circumstances, ticked instead of refer to M.E. The family wanted a next-day viewing. If we're doing restorative, Marla said quietly, reading my face, we'll need 4 hours minimum. Not yet, I said. Fridge, top rack. I'm going to talk to the wife. We zipped the bag, logged the personal effects wedding ring on the left hand, loose. Cool shrinkage will do that. Wallet containing $63 and a driver's license. One key fob for a Ford, a business card bent in half with the logo of Northway Construction, and moved him into the cold. The shelf rails squealed the way they always squeal when they're reminding you the job is physical. In the arrangement room, Benton's wife sat with her coat still on, knuckles white around a clutch of tissues. She was younger than I expected, somewhere in her early 30s, eyes red raw, hair in the ponytail of a person who left the house without looking at a mirror. I'm sorry for your loss, I said, the phrase that is both completely true and completely insufficient. I want to go over a few details to make sure we honor your wishes. She nodded, mechanical. We went through the basic service time, obituary, flowers, military honors, none, faith preference, non-denominational, clothing for him to wear. She would bring a suit. It was when we got to the personal life field that people either open up or shut down. What did Cole do for work? I asked. Construction, she said. Northway. He was a site lead. He just, her voice caught, just got the promotion. And yesterday, do you know where he was headed? Home, she said. He texted at 10, said he was leaving the yard. I could have left it there. I should have. This is not my part of the job. I'm not a detective. But the bands around the wrists were like a drumbeat in my head. There are sometimes injuries we see that don't match the story the paperwork tells, I said carefully. If I notice anything like that, I usually suggest we request the hospital to supplement their records. Her eyes sharpened. Grief makes people slow and fast at the same time. What kind of injuries? She said. Marks from restraints, I said, gentle, and watched the word land. She stared at me. Then she looked at the paperwork in front of her, the brochure with our prices, the authorization forms, the DMV donor card, and for a second her face did something complicated. Shock, recognition, fear, calculation. I don't know anything about that, she said. I nodded. I understand. You said the hospital released him, she added, almost accusing. So it's an accident. That's what the paperwork says. She stood abruptly. I need to go. I'll bring the suit. I walked her to the door. When she reached the sidewalk, she paused and turned back. If you need to call me about anything, she said, words stiff, like she was reading them off a card. Call the number on the form. Not my cell. The other one. The house? No, she said. She swallowed. Cole's supervisor. He's helping. He said he'd handle things. She left before I could ask why a supervisor would be the person to call about a dead Nana's body. At 4:05 p.m., we ran the service for the family we had waiting. I wore my face, the professional empathy that is not a mask so much as a uniform. Ushers moved like a tide. The hymn was sung off-key in a way that made it more true. For an hour, my head stayed inside that room, and then I stepped back into the fluorescent hum of the hall, and my thoughts snapped back to the cold room and the narrow bands on Benton's wrists. The first call came at 5:22 p.m. Director Benton. The voice on the line was male, late 40s maybe, too cheerful by half. This is Director Morell, I said. Who's calling? Sorry, Morell, right? He laughed like we were old friends. I'm Jason Ward. I run operations over at Northway. We're all torn up over Cole. I told his wife I'd check in, be a shoulder. Appreciated, I said. I waited. So listen, he said, the word stretching. The wife said you might be doing a quickie, viewing tomorrow. We're hoping to pop a few guys by, pay respects. No need to make it a thing. We accommodate family wishes, I said. Visitation is up to Mrs. Benton. Right, totally. And listen about the hospital paperwork? Don't let those A guys bury you in forms. It was a real simple accident. Black ice. Ditch. Real shame. Of course, I said, feeling the shape of the call now. If I need anything additional from the hospital, I'll reach out through the normal channels. A beat. His smile moved over the line like a shark moving under a pier. Do me a favor? If anything comes up, call me first. Save you some time. I've got the doc's ear. I have yours now, I said. That's enough. He paused. The cheerfulness cooled a degree. We good, Morell? We're fine, I said, and hung up. Marla was standing at the doorway, mouth a small line. Who was that? Northway, I said. Friendly. Friendly like a hand on your shoulder, or friendly like a hand over your mouth? She said, let's get him ready for refrigeration, I said. Top rack isn't going to cool evenly with that many in there. We switched Benton to a different shelf, checked the thermostat, 37.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and logged out. I turned off the prep room light and locked the door out of habit. At 6:03 p.m., I left through the side entrance into a dusk the color of bruised fruit. The second call came at 9:41 p.m., when I was at home with a TV dinner sweating on the coffee table. Unknown number. I let it ring twice. Morell. Silence, then the kind of breath that isn't sure it wants to be on a line. When the voice came, it was barely louder than the hiss. Don't cut him, a woman said. Who is this? Don't cut him, she repeated, urgent. Don't make him look pretty. Leave him, or it won't stop. The line went dead. I stared at my phone until the screen went black. Then I called the funeral home and checked the door sensors from the panel app, one of the only modern concessions I've allowed myself. All secure, all quiet. In my mind, the narrow bands around the wrists had become ropes. The shallow diagonal abrasion had become a scrape against a floor. The fingertip bruises on the upper arm belonged to a hand I could almost see. Sleep pretended to flirt with me, and then left with someone younger. I went back at 11:20 p.m. The building at night is a different building. The exit signs breed a green light. The HVA sea throat clears every 15 minutes like an old man, and the chapels hold their breath. I keyed in, disarmed the alarm, and walked straight to the cold room. The lock turned the way it always turns. Inside, The smell is a quiet, metallic sweet, the condensed breath of steel and plastic, and the faintest echo of formaldehyde from the prep room next door. I slid open the top rack. Benton was where we left him, zip closed, tag at the top. Quiet as all the others. But the zipper tab stupid detail, Tiny lay on the wrong side. I always zip from head to foot. Every intake, every time. It's a habit the staff jokes about. Morals runway. The tab was parked at the top end now, not down by the feet where I leave it. And on the clear viewing panel near the face left unzipped for identification when families requested, there was a faint smear across the inside of the plastic. 4 short arcs. The kind a gloved hand would leave if it tried to push out. I put my palm flat on the vinyl. Cold bled through the latex. I told myself what I tell families when the world comes apart. There's a sequence, and you follow it. First, you check your systems. Second, you check your logs. Third, you check your assumptions. Someone was in here, Marla said behind me. I hadn't heard the door. She held her phone like a shield, the flashlight blooming in the corridor. I saw your car. Zipper's wrong, I said. I didn't touch him, she said. Nor did I. We stood there for a long minute without speaking, listening to the compressor thrumming in the wall. Then I zipped the bag open down to his shoulders and folded the flap. Benton's face, preserved by the cold, stared at the seam of light above us. There was a new mark along his jawline, right where skin meets stubble. A faint, rectangular bruise I hadn't logged earlier. Patterned, the kind you get from pressure against something with an edge. A belt buckle pressing down. A phone case. Or a boot toe. I took a photo. Then another. I logged the time. I'm not a detective. But I can document. I can write. I can keep a record when everyone else is trying to erase one. We closed him and pushed the rack back in. I relocked the cold room, and this time tugged the handle to feel the bolt settle. Back in the office, the phone blinked with a voicemail I hadn't heard come in. Director Morrell, the message began, the same cheer scrubbed now to polite steel. Jason Ward, Northway. Hope I didn't catch you too late. Friendly reminder. Family wants quick turnaround. No autopsy, no hold-ups. If you need anything. Anything. Call me first. The click at the end was loud as a gunshot in the empty room. Marla looked at me. What are we doing? The job, I said. By the book. And when the book burns? Then we write another one, I said, and picked up the phone to call the hospital for the full trauma notes, the ones they don't fax, unless you know exactly which words to say. I've spent 20 years in the business of the dead. Most of that time, the paperwork and the bodies tell the same story. That night, for the first time in a long time, the body told me something the paper didn't. It was not a scream. It was insistence. And it was the kind of cold that doesn't let you dress for it. If there's one thing the dead have taught me, it's that nothing is truly isolated. One body leads to another. One injury mirrors another. And if you keep your eyes open long enough, you start seeing lines where everyone else sees dots. I didn't sleep after leaving the cold room that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, the phone on silent, and Benton's intake photo glowing on my laptop. My coffee went from hot to cold to the color of ditch water. The marks on his wrists and ankles felt less like possible restraint and more like a statement. Someone had owned him for those last hours. The second name by the time I got to the funeral home the next morning, Marla was already in the prep room, filling out chemical mix sheets for the day's cases. She handed me the intake folder for a new arrival from the hospital. Name, Dean Cutter. Age, 42. Cause of death, self-inflicted hanging. Released without ME. I flipped through the paperwork and felt my stomach tighten. Hospital again? I asked. She nodded. Same E-Doc that signed Benton out. Dr. H. Scribble signature. The transport brought him in at 9:47 a.m. Same black bag, same condensation on the tag. I unzipped to verify ID, expecting the telltale ligature mark under the jaw. It was there, angling upward toward the ears like it should, but it was shallow, the skin barely blanched. Not what you see when the body's weight has done the work. And then I saw the wrists. Same bands. Same half-inch pressure lines, pale in the middle. "Marla," I said without looking up, "get me last month's logs." "Any other cases from Northway Construction employees?" She froze. This guy worked there too? The wallet was still in his jeans. Driver's license. Northway business card. Cross-referencing the dead, while she pulled files, I went to the small staff break room with my laptop. Our system logs every intake, name, date, cause, and if provided employer. It's not mandatory, but a lot of families mention it for obituary purposes. I searched Northway. In the last 8 months, we'd had 5 Northway employees come through here. 3 accident fatalities, 1 suicide, 1 heart attack, all under 50, all men. And now Benton and Cutter made 7. The unofficial files. I keep 2 sets of records, the official ones in the system and the ones in a locked metal box in my office. The second set is where I write the details that don't make sense, the things that might matter someday. Benton was already in there. Now I added Cutter. Same wrist and ankle marks, same no ME release. When I'm writing those notes, I try to be clinical, no speculation, no drama. Just intake the 14th of February, Cutter Dean. Pressure bands, wrists, ankles. Ligature mark inconsistent with weight suspension. Employer, Northway. It doesn't sound like much on paper, but stacked with the others, it starts to hum. The visit. At 1:15 p.m., while I was in the arrangement room with Benton's wife, Marla came to the door. "You've got a visitor," she said. "Not scheduled." I excused myself and stepped into the hall. Jason Ward was standing there in a Northway polo, smiling like we'd been in the same fraternity. "Director," he said, hand extended. "Heard you had another one of ours." I didn't take his hand. "Mr. Ward, this is not the time. Call me Jason. Just thought I'd drop by, make sure the family's being taken care of. Cutter's people are tight-knit. I want to know he'll be handled right." He said handled in a way that wasn't about embalming. "Every family gets the same care here," I said. "Good, good." His eyes scanned the hallway, the closed doors. "And no more of that hospital rigmarole, yeah? They already sent everything you need. No reason to go digging." The way he said digging made my jaw clench. The quiet threat when I didn't answer. He leaned closer. "You know, Director, in construction we have a saying, don't to poke at the foundation, unless you want the whole building to come down on you. Same applies here." Then he smiled again, clapped me on the shoulder, and walked out like he'd just given me a weather report. The pattern in the bruises. That night, I stayed late. I wheeled Benton and Cutter into the prep room, side by side. Under the bright lights, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Same width and depth of wristbands. Same fingertip bruising high on the arms. Same clay grit embedded in the back of their shirts. And both had faint bruises along the jawline, almost rectangular. I took more photos. When I zipped them back in, I noticed something else. Their personal effects bags each contained a bent Northway business card. Benton's was creased in half. Cutter's was folded into a sharp triangle, like a habit or a signal. I locked the cold room and stood in the dark hallway, listening to the compressor's hum. 2 bodies in 2 days, both from the same company, both carrying the same marks, and both signed out of the hospital by the same doctor. No autopsy. Whatever this was, it wasn't a coincidence. And I knew standing there, with the smell of steel and disinfectant in my nose, that if I kept following it, I might end up in the cold room myself. By the third day, I could feel it someone watching the building. It wasn't paranoia, not the way the fluorescent lights in the prep room sometimes made the corners seem darker. This was different. The kind of quiet pressure you feel when someone has taken a sudden and specific interest in you. At 8:45 that morning, I was outside behind the funeral home, breaking down a stack of cardboard boxes for recycling. The alley behind our building, ice and busy, just a strip of cracked asphalt between us and a chain-link fence that separates the lot from the back of a storage warehouse. That's when I noticed a dark SUV idling across the street, angled just enough for the passenger window to face me. Tinted glass, no plates on the front bumper. I didn't think much of it at first. People get lost around here looking for the DMV, but the SUV stayed, engine running. When I came back out 15 minutes later with another load of boxes, it was gone. By noon, the Benton family had come and gone for a private viewing. They didn't speak much, and I didn't push them. After they left, I went into the prep room to reset. That's when I saw the cold room door ajar. I locked that door every time. Inside, Benton's and Cutter's racks were both pulled halfway out, their tags twisted around like someone had been inspecting them in a hurry. The zipper tabs were exactly where ID left them at the foot, but the personal effects bags on the top shelf were missing. My stomach dropped. Those bags were chain of custody items. Wallets, IDs, that bent Northway business card from Benton's case. They were all gone. I went straight to the office and checked the security feed. The camera outside the cold room was dark. No footage. Just a frozen still frame for 9:07 a. Someone had killed the camera, gone in, and left without tripping the alarm. At 3:22 p.m., Marla came into my office, holding a plain manila envelope. "This was on the front desk when I came back from lunch," she said. "No return address. No markings except my name in thick black marker." I opened it. Inside were 6 photographs, printed on glossy paper. The first 3 were of me, outside the building, breaking down boxes that morning, taken from across the street. The 4th was of me in the prep room, leaning over Benton's body. The 5th was of me in my office the night before, looking at my laptop. The 6th was black and white, grainy, like it had been printed from an old surveillance camera. It showed me standing in the cold room with the racks pulled out, looking down at Benton. But here's the thing. The photo was taken from inside the room. The last item in the envelope was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, just block letters cut from a magazine and glued into words like a ransom note. "Stop looking, or you'll be next on the rack." I sat there, the photos spread across my desk, and tried to decide if I was angry or afraid. Both, maybe. But mostly, I felt something else, a creeping certainty that someone was already 3 steps ahead of me. The cold room wasn't just where they were sending their dead. It was where they were sending their messages. That evening, after Marla left, I stayed behind. I locked the office door, killed the lights, and sat at my desk with the blinds drawn. I waited to see if they'd come again. At 11:46 p.m., the alley motion sensor triggered on my phone app. The alert showed a grainy still from the side camera, a figure in a hooded jacket, face obscured, standing at the cold room service entrance. By the time I got there, the alley was empty. The only sign anyone had been, there was a fresh scuff mark on the doorframe, like something had been pressed against it, hard, before they decided to leave. I locked up again, but sleep wasn't coming. I knew 2 things for sure. Whoever I was dealing with wasn't afraid to get inside my building, and they wanted me to know exactly how easy it was for them. I had the distinct, sour feeling that the next time they came, they wouldn't just be looking at the racks. It was Marla who broke it open. Not on purpose, at least, I don't think so. But sometimes the truth doesn't come in a confession. It slips out in something small, a detail that doesn't fit until you turn it the right way. It was just after 8 a.m. when the delivery van rolled up to our side entrance. Not a hospital transport, no markings. Just a white panel van with a dent in the rear door. 2 men got out, neither wearing hospital scrubs. One was built like a dock worker, the other wiry, eyes darting like he was late for something. They signed the intake form quickly, avoided eye contact, and were gone in under 3 minutes. The black bag they left behind was zipped, tagged, and cold to the touch. Hospital release? I asked Marla, who had been at the desk. Sort of, she said, sliding the paperwork across the counter. The release was from a private care clinic I'd never heard of. No doctor's name, just initials HS, and a stamp that looked like it had been photocopied one too many times. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. In the prep room, I unzipped the bag. Male, late 20s. Fit build. No signs of advanced illness. Bruising high on the arms. Faint bands at the wrists. Same pattern. Marla came in behind me with gloves on, ready to assist. Family hasn't called yet, she said. Northway employee. I stopped mid-note on the intake form. You sure? Wallet was in the bag. Company ID clipped inside. 7 became 8. When we were done logging the body into the cold room, I noticed something. Marla took the personal effects bag, walked toward the storage cabinet, and then veered into her office instead. Hey, I called. Where are you putting those? She froze, then held up the bag. Just double-checking the list. I'll file it after. I nodded, but the moment lodged in my head like a splinter. That night, after she left, I went into her office. Nothing obvious, just a desk, filing cabinet, a corkboard with service schedules. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of order forms, I found an old banker's box. Inside were at least a dozen personal effects, bags, sealed, tagged, but not logged in the official cabinet. All Northway cases. Benton's wallet was there, Cutter's too, and every bag was missing one item, the bent Northway business card. At 10:14 p.m., I called the only cop in this town I trusted, Detective Aaron Ladd, a former homicide who'd been demoted to property crimes for asking the wrong people the right questions. You're telling me, she said after I laid it out, that you've got stolen evidence from multiple suspicious deaths, all tied to the same company? Yes, and someone on my staff is moving it. You need to get those items in my hands. Tonight. I locked the box in my office, intending to bring it to Ladd in the morning. But when I came back from the restroom, 15 minutes later, the office door was open. The lock wasn't broken. The box was gone. Sitting in its place was a fresh envelope, unsealed. Inside was a single bent Northway business card, creased sharply in half. On the back, in neat block print, we decide who gets cold. I knew then that this wasn't just about Benton or Cutter. Northway wasn't hiding a few bad accidents. They were running a system, selecting who went into the cold room, controlling the paperwork, erasing the signs before anyone could ask questions. And now they knew I'd seen too much. The night the box disappeared, I stopped pretending I could handle this quietly. If Northway could walk into my building, take what they wanted, and leave me a calling card without breaking a lock, then I wasn't just a bystander. I was already on their list. It came the next morning. I was in my office at 7:15, blinds still drawn, when the phone rang. No caller ID. Morrell, I answered. Jason Ward's voice was smoother than I expected. Director, let's cut through it. You've been curious, maybe too curious. And that's inconvenient. I know what you're doing, I said, and I'm not going to. He cut me off. I'm not here to argue morality. I'm here to give you an out. Leave town. We'll cover your payout. Sell the business to someone who knows how to mind their own. You walk away clean, or you get cold. he said simply, and hung up. I stared at the silent phone for a long minute. Every instinct said to pack a bag and go. I'd seen enough bodies with those same marks to know he wasn't bluffing. But walking away would mean every Benton, every Cutter, every unnamed man whose cause of death was signed off without a question. They'd just keep coming. That was the part I couldn't live with. I rang Detective Ladd. If I disappear, I told her, it's Northway. And I've got one more piece for you. What is it? She asked. Evidence they can't walk out with. I'd spent the night copying every intake photo, every chain of custody form, every scrap of detail from the last 2 years onto a flash drive. I told her where I'd stash it taped, inside the drain pipe behind the old crematory. That afternoon, a new body came in. Northway employee. Cause, fall from height. The bands on the wrists were so fresh, they still had the faint imprint of whatever material had cut in. I took the photos, logged them once in the official file, once on the drive. At 6:02 p.m., I slipped out the side door and hid the drive where I'd told Ladd. When I came back inside, Jason Ward was sitting in the arrangement room. Alone. You've had your chance, he said. I didn't answer. Just walked past him to my office, locked the door, and started writing this every detail, every name on paper. Paper they couldn't delete from a hard drive. By the time I heard the side entrance open again, I was on the last page. Footsteps in the hall. Slow. Measured. I folded the papers, slid them under the false bottom of my desk drawer, and waited. The door handle turned. I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow. I don't know if this will end up in a police evidence locker or in a trash fire behind a construction site. But I do know this. If anyone finds these notes, and if the bodies keep showing up with the same marks, don't just sign the paperwork. Look at the wrists. Because that's where the story starts.